government officials insist that this is an isolated incident, yet the attack is perhaps perhaps we will continue to keep you informed as this story unfolds.
What's going on, everyone? Hey, welcome to Real Life. Man, so glad that we can hang out today, whether you are in the room or you're hanging out outside or online. So glad you made this part of your weekend, especially if you are here for the very first time. I cannot put into words how grateful we are to have you as our guest. In fact, if you call Real Life home, will you put your hands together and help me welcome anyone that's here for the very first time? I'm serious, we mean it. And I sure hope you will do what Juan encouraged you to do. Swing by those orange tents on the way out, get that gift that's waiting for you. If you were with us last weekend, then you know it was one for the history books. One of the cool parts of being on the team here is that we get to plan and pray about what God wants to do, but we're really clear about our role. We can create environments and experiences that set up God to do what he can do, but we have never changed a heart. We've never changed a mind. We've never changed a life. That is only God. And so somewhere in the planning process, we put on some silly little spreadsheet that last weekend was going to be a baptism weekend. And as I left here, I felt God just chuckling at our plans, saying, you're going to need more t-shirts, and you're going to need more towels, and you're going to get a good mop because there's going to be water everywhere. Because friends, there were 240 women and men and students that went all in through baptism last weekend. Spectacular. And I'm telling you, I went home and my hands hurt from clapping so much, and my eyes were stinging from all the tears that were welling up, because I got to see dads embracing their children as they were still dripping wet. And I saw a 96-year-old woman get baptized last weekend, because it is never too late for grace. And I saw friends surprise one another in line. Neither of them knew each other was getting baptized. They got to go all in together. And I saw a middle school girl who stood up in her living room where she was watching online, and her family jumped in the car and raced over to campus so she could get baptized, because you just don't wait on moments like that. And from the bottom of my heart, I want to say thank you. Thank you for being the kind of church where something like that can happen. And thank you for inviting our family to be a part of it. And thank you for never settling for what has always been, because I'm convinced God's just getting started. So will you join me one more time in celebrating each and every one of those people that went all in? One of the best days of my life. And if you are new to church, new to Real Life, new to faith at all, maybe you're one of those people that got baptized last week, I want you to know there's an open invitation for you to go hang out at Next Steps. Now, it happens once a month during the Thursday night service and then during the 10 a.m. service. So there's a whole lot of people over there in room 101. But you're going to have another chance in a couple weeks. And it is designed to help you do what I think you want to do anyway, which is grow more convinced and committed in your faith. It's going to be an hour long. Your kids can hang out in kids ministry. And I think it'll be really instrumental as you grow in your relationship with Jesus. So next month, you got the opportunity to jump into Next Steps. Now, if you're new around here, you should know that our mission as a church is to help people find and follow Jesus. And so there was a weekend last weekend where we invited a whole lot of people to find Jesus for the very first time. But then our goal is to walk with those people for the rest of their lives, to follow Jesus. And if I'm reading the room right, and I got the right temperature on our cultural moment as a country, I get the feeling that we could all use a little help knowing how to follow Jesus right now. And so that's why we're kicking off this series today called Neon. Now, I'm 99.9% sure that you do not know the history of the neon sign, but do not worry. I did the research for you, okay? All this information is coming from the Neon Museum in Las Vegas, because where else would the Neon Museum be other than Las Vegas? And they said the first neon sign was invented in 1912 in France. It was used by a Parisian hairdresser, but the first neon sign in the United States is a hotly debated historical fact amongst the neon nerds, but one of them may have been in Los Angeles at the corner of 7th and Flower. It was a sign advertising a Packard Automobiles car dealership. And it was so new and it was so novel that people from all over Los Angeles gathered to just look at the sign. And the crowd grew so big that the police had to show up and get everybody to go home. And if you ever wonder what a pastor does all week, it's look up stuff like that, all right? It's for you. I'm here for you. Now, the purpose of a neon sign is to bring good news in the dark. That's the whole point of it. And so maybe you were attending a concert in a new city and you were getting anxious because it was about to start, and finally you saw this good news in the dark. You said, okay, I know now where to park. Or maybe you and your significant other thought the other one had made the hotel reservations and realized you don't have anywhere to stay, and you saw this really good news in the dark. Finally, you could find a place to sleep. Or maybe you were hanging out on the mean streets of Burbank late at night and you needed a snack, and you saw this incredible news in the dark right here that there was a hot and fresh donut waiting for you. There may be no better good news in the dark than a Krispy Kreme. But a neon sign, their job is to bring good news in the dark. And you and I, we're living at a very unique moment in time. And sometimes it can feel a little scary. It can feel a little dark. And some of our problems that we're facing as a culture and as a country, even as families, are as old as time. Because people have always been people. And we keep making those same mistakes really forever. And so a lot of this isn't new. But then there are some unique layers that have been created in our world really in the last 4 or 5 years that we're still learning to navigate. And so here's the big question that we're going to be wrestling with for the next 4 weeks is, how do we follow Jesus in a world that isn't? One more time. How do we do this? Like functionally, practically, effectively, how do we follow Jesus in a world that isn't? Like, how do I stay true to what I believe God said is true without being viewed as hateful by the rest of the world? How do I raise a teenager to know and love Jesus when the primary message of social media right now is drawing people away from God? Any other parents wrestling with that one? How do I invite my friends and my colleagues to know Jesus without being weird and obnoxious? How do we follow Jesus in a world that isn't? And when we're wrestling with that big question, there are really 2 primary temptations when we encounter the scary stuff in this world. And the first one is to freak out. Anyone that ever freaked out about something they saw in the world? Usually it's a news article in our feed one day, and it's about a nefarious group that's attacking our values. And so what do? We freak out, we lash out, we share that story, and then we add our sharply worded post on top of it, referring to those people as the enemy. And we try to build these impenetrable walls around the people that we love and shelter our kids as long as we can. And we may even come to the conclusion that everyone that disagrees with us is the bad guys. We freak out. Or we swing the pendulum all the way to the other side to where we don't freak out. Instead, we blend in. And we don't want to rock the boat at work. We don't want to stand out at school. And so we end up looking like and acting like and thinking like and living like everyone else. There's no perceptible difference between us and everyone around us. There might be some privately held beliefs, but they would come as a surprise to everyone around us. And so we just blend in to the background. But over the next couple weeks, I'd like to propose that freak out and blend in aren't our only 2 options. In fact, we're going to look at a model from the Bible of a man who learned not to freak out or blend in, but instead to stand firm. It is entirely possible to remain convicted about truth, but also be compassionate to those who disagree with us. It's possible to be courageous and full of character. Now, it might require some nuance and some emotional intelligence and a whole lot of resilience, but it is absolutely possible. That's why one of the early church leaders named Paul, he wrote this in a book called Romans. He said, don't copy, don't blend in with the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. Friends, not to freak you out, but every single day, there is someone or a bunch of people that are trying to change your mind, trying to change the way you think, trying to change what you believe. And if we give God access to our heads and our hearts, He will transform us to believe what is good and pleasing and perfect, to where we can live a life that brings good news into the dark. And so that's why over the next couple weeks, we're going to be in a book of the Bible called Daniel. And if you have a Bible or a Bible app or the Real Life app, you can head in that direction to Daniel chapter 1. It's in the Old Testament. And here's going to be my encouragement to you in the coming weeks. I would love for you to figure out some way of taking some notes in this series. And the reason I'm encouraging you to do that, it's not because I think I got something brilliant to say. It's because sometimes God teaches us something in moments like this, and I don't want you to leave it here. I don't want you to leave it in the room, on campus, in this moment. I want you to take it in the car ride with you. Talk about it over lunch. Discuss it in your groups. And so you can take notes in the Real Life app, in your Notes app on your phone. You can even use good old-fashioned pen and paper. I don't care how you take a note, but write something down and allow it to marinate all week long as God is transforming us from the inside out. Now, the reason that we're hanging out with Daniel is because he is one of the very few models in the Bible of someone who lived a life full of faithfulness from beginning to end. And I know that sounds kind of weird because you would think like the people that made the cut to get into the Bible must have been the good ones. But if you read it very well, there's a whole lot of people that made a mess of their lives, that wrecked it by self-imposed circumstances. And Daniel is one of the few that was able to follow God faithfully his entire life. And so as we jump in today, he is going to be our model as to how to live for God in a world that isn't. Let's begin. Daniel chapter 1. Verse 1 says like this. During the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim's reign in Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. All right, let's press pause right here. If you ever read the Bible on your own, which is something that I desperately hope you will do, sometimes you'll read a sentence like this with funny sounding names and places that aren't on maps anymore, and you will think, I'm done, all right? I'm not even going to bother. I'm not going to fight through this. What could this possibly have to do with me? But I promise I don't want you to trip up on sentences like this and think none of it has to do with you. Let me give you some context, all right? Jehoiakim was the king of Judah, and at the time, Judah was God's people, which meant that God would provide and protect uniquely for Judah. And the deal is that they were supposed to follow God different than all of their neighbors. But Jehoiakim was a terrible king. He surrounded himself with yes men, and he led his people away from God. And God had warned them that if they weren't obedient, if they weren't continuing to follow him well, then he would allow for something like this to happen. In comes King Nebuchadnezzar from Babylon. Babylon was the reigning superpower of the region at the time, and they show up and take over Jerusalem. Now, to the untrained eye, looking at this historical event, it just looks like one big army took over a small army. One superpower took over a nation. That's all there is to it. But I want you to watch how our narrator Daniel describes this historical event because he's got a different perspective. And here's what I'd love for you to do. You're going to see the verse on the screen, and when we get to a word that is underlined, I'd love for you to say it out loud with me so that we can hear ourselves say it. It'll help it sink in to our heads and our hearts. I know you can do this. All right, here we go. Verses 2 and 3. It says, "The Lord gave him victory over King Jehoiakim of Judah and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. So Nebuchadnezzar took them back to the land of Babylonia and placed them in the treasure house of his God." Now, my guess is that the residents of Jerusalem were surprised and overwhelmed by what happened to their hometown. A foreign nation just came over and took them over. And they were thinking, man, who is in charge? And why are they so bad at it? And how do we vote them out? Does that sound familiar to anyone else? They were panicking. But here's what Daniel understood that they didn't. He was saying that it was actually God that allowed it. I said, God was the one that gave Nebuchadnezzar victory. It wasn't his military brilliance. It was God that permitted him to steal that stuff from the temple. It wasn't Nebuchadnezzar's might. God was behind the scenes the whole time. And so often, I think we get confused about that. We often, when we're talking to God, if you talk to God, when you talk to God, you usually talk about your stuff. This is my life. These are my things. And these are my people, and this is my career, and this is my life to live. And God, I will let you know if I need an emergency plan, but for the most part, this is on me. And what we fail to realize is that God is still behind the scenes all the time. It reminds me of the dynamic that we have at home. I have a 15-year-old daughter, and like most 15-year-olds these days, she has a phone that she uses. And like most parents of 15-year-olds today, I hate that phone. All right? Anyone else with me on that one, okay? And you might think, well, weren't you the one that gave her the phone? I said, yes, but let me explain. It was her first day of middle school, and that is a terrible day for literally everyone. And so she's nervous about it. She's anxious about it. I drop her off. And somehow her mother and I crossed lines, and we thought the other one was picking her up from school. Only to realize after hours after the day had ended, neither of us had our daughter. And so I raced over to school and I picked up this puddle of tears and put it into my car. And with all the dad guilt in the world, I showed up the very next morning as soon as the Apple store opened to make sure this never happened again. And I have regretted giving it to her every second since, all right? I hate this thing. Now, sometimes in our family, what she'll do is she'll look at us in all of her 15-year-old wisdom, and she will say that she deserves to have full access to her phone to do whatever she wants. And I'll say, oh, that's interesting, because I remember being the one that bought the phone. And I think every single month, I'm the one that pays the bill, and I was the one that fixed the cracked screen. So technically, it's actually my phone that I let you use. And if you think that that is an effective argument to end the conversation, you do not know 15-year-old girls. It's not how it works. But it's the same dynamic that Daniel's describing here with King Nebuchadnezzar. He's saying everybody on the outside looked like one strong man beat the other strong man. But in reality, God was behind the scenes the whole time. And so friends, I got some good news for you. God is calling the shots. It was true in Daniel's time. It's true in ours. God permits, and God gives, God blesses, God heals, God is on the throne, and you and I are not, and that is a really good thing. And so you may have walked in here today overwhelmed and anxious. It might be about something personal, might be about something political. It could be micro, it could be macro, it doesn't really matter. This is still really good news. So what I want to invite you to do is, here in a second, I'm going to count to 3. And while we're looking at this truth, I want us to take a deep breath and let it out, okay? You ready? I want you to look right here at the screen, take a deep breath and let it out. 1, 2, 3. Friends, this truth should bring us peace, and it should bring us comfort. And it doesn't mean it answers every single question that you and I have, but it does remind us of who has always been in control from the beginning of time. But here's what the challenge was for Daniel, and it's still the challenge for us, is that Daniel fully believed that God was in control, but also his life was about to get a lot worse. And it's that gap that confuses so many of us. We're saying, hold on, yeah, like I love the idea that God is calling the shots, but my life is still really hard. And I'm not asking for perfect. I just don't want to be in so much debt. I don't want to be grieving. I don't want to be on the verge of divorce. I don't want to be so lonely. So how can it be true that God is in control, but my life is so difficult? And I want you to watch what happened to Daniel, someone that was perfectly and supremely convinced that God was calling the shots. Look what happened in his life next. Verse 3. It says, then the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. Select only strong, healthy, and good-looking young men, he said. Make sure they are well-versed in every branch of learning, are gifted with knowledge and good judgment, and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon. The king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his kitchens. They were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. So our narrator Daniel here, he's just been kidnapped from his family, stolen from his hometown, placed in a foreign palace where he's supposed to learn a foreign language, eat foreign food, understand foreign worldviews so that someday he would look and act and live like a Babylonian. At the time, this right here, Daniel and his buddies, they were teenagers. Can you imagine how terrifying all of that must have been? But what you and I just read, whether we realized it or not, is the same blueprint that the enemy has been using to discourage people in their faith from the beginning of time. I like the way one of my friends said it. He said, the Bible doesn't just tell us what happened. The Bible tells us what always happens. Sometimes when we think about God's word, we think about it as like, oh man, it was written so long ago and on the other side of the world, and what could it have to do with me? But the Bible isn't just recording historical facts. It's illustrating patterns that have been haunting humanity since the beginning of time. And so what happened to Daniel is the same thing that the enemy wants to do to you and me. And here's the 3-step plan. Number 1, separation. Notice the first move Nebuchadnezzar made with those young men was to get them away from their family, get them away from their faith community, get them away from their support system so that then they would be vulnerable to new ideas. And I haven't been around forever, but I've been around long enough to know this. People leave the family of God before they leave their faith in God. This is the sequence that has happened over and over and over again. People will grow disconnected from the church, disconnected from healthy relationships that are trying to chase Jesus in the same way, live life on their own, and then all of a sudden, before you know it, they've changed what they think, changed what they believe. See, the reason that it's so hard to follow Jesus on our own as an island is because that was never the design in the first place. I've needed so many people in my life that when they were listening to what I was struggling with, they would say back to me, Jake, you know that's not true. Or when they would see me striving for things in my life, they'd say, man, you know that doesn't matter. I need you and you need me, and none of us were meant to do this on our own. Now, before you argue back that like, hey, what about the church? I mean, the church is super flawed. I know. I'm part of it. So are you. It's never going to be perfect. She's got bumps and bruises, and I know it's not always easy, but I'm also convinced that church, that community at its best is the church, when we have one another's back. So right now, if you're here today and you're kind of flying solo and you've been hesitant to take a step of connection or even make yourself known, I want you to know that we love you and we're for you, and also don't go any longer. Don't do this on your own because you are so vulnerable. Step number one is separation. Step number two is indoctrination. They were trying to change the way that he thought. And so Daniel was enrolled in a 3-year school where he would read Babylonian books and listen to Babylonian lectures, and so that someday he would become Babylonian. But you and I, we don't have to enroll in a 3-year school to have our minds changed. All we have to do is unlock our phones. And through those little screens, we are being fed messages on a regular basis. Through algorithms and advertisements and subtle messages, people are trying to change the way we think while we're just watching the ball game, listening to our favorite podcast, scrolling our feed. And so first is separation, second is indoctrination, and then the third step is repetition. Repetition, over and over and over again. When you and I see so many people that believe something different than us, we can come to the conclusion that we're the only ones hanging on to this old stuff. And we're in the back of the day, and we're on the wrong side of history. And when we're convinced that everyone else has moved on but us, we will be willing to change what we think. Now, the reason I lay this blueprint out for you isn't to freak you out, but it's to raise our awareness. You see, the hardest fight for you and I to win is the one we don't even know that we're in. Every single day, someone is trying to change your mind, change what you believe, change what you love. And we got to know that that's what's happening to us. And so Daniel, not only were they trying to change his mind, but if you go home this week and you read the rest of Daniel chapter 1, which I would love for you to do, you'll know that they changed his name. Went after his identity, gave him a Babylonian name. And then they went after his body. They changed his diet. They said, here's what you're going to eat. You're going to eat the finest food from the king's kitchen, and we're going to give you a Babylonian menu. But the problem was, for Daniel, as a devout Jew, there were certain foods on the Babylonian menu that were declared unclean for faithful followers of God. Now, it's not because this diet was super special and made you look like the Rock everywhere you went. It just meant that God wanted his people looking different than the rest of the nations. And so Daniel raised his hand. He said, I can't eat all of that. That's going to go against what God has asked me to do. Will you just feed me and my friends vegetables and water for 10 days straight and see if we look okay at the end of that trial period? Now, I want to be really clear. It's not because a vegetarian diet is more holy, all right? I just want to be really clear, because if I had to convince you to follow Jesus and be vegetarian, I don't think I would be very successful. That'd be kind of a bummer. All Daniel was doing is he was saying, this isn't who God asked me to be. And look at the results. This is at the end of 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who had been eating the food assigned by the king. So after that, the attendant fed them only vegetables instead of the food and wine provided for the others. God gave these 4 young men an unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of literature and wisdom. And God gave Daniel the special ability to interpret the meanings of visions and dreams. Daniel's willingness to stand out was rewarded. Daniel's willingness to be different than all of his coworkers, it was rewarded with influence. That he was rising in the ranks and had more influence on what was going on around him. But Daniel was really clear. He didn't take credit himself. He said that was all God. God gave. God permitted. God gave him skills and abilities. God gave him favor in the king's court. It was all God. So today, I'd like to leave you with one big idea and one date to put on your calendar. Here's the big idea. God is in control of who is in control. If you're taking notes, I'd love for you to write that one down. Put it on your desk this week. Put it on your phone. Write it on your mirror, wherever you will see it. God is in control of who is in control. Some of this anxiety that's brewing right now in our country is a fear that if the wrong person ends up in control, usually the way we say it is if the other side's person ends up in control, then we are all doomed. And it's true that moments like these matter. Because ideas don't just stay on paper, they become policies. And policies affect the real lives of people. And so we should not be flippant about the decisions that we make. But we can also take comfort in that God is in control of who is in control. The fancy Bible word for that is the word sovereign. And it means that throughout the generations and throughout the dynasties, throughout the globe, throughout every single administration, there has been exactly one person that has been in charge, and that is God. That's why Daniel didn't freak out about Nebuchadnezzar. That's why you and I aren't going to freak out ourselves. So will you do me a favor? Will you pull out your phone real quick? I want you to take a picture of something. We're going to put some verses on the screen behind me. And these verses are going to illustrate that truth, that God is in control of who is in control. Just take a snapshot. And if this week you find your blood pressure rising a little bit, if you find that you're a little out of breath, that your heart's beating a little too fast, that anxiety and worry about the future is starting to dominate your mind, I'd love for you to look up one of these verses. Look it up in your Bible. You can Google it if you need to. And what it will do will settle our hearts. That God has been in control from the beginning of time. He will reign throughout all of eternity, and we can rest in that fact. Then I want to put a date on your calendar as well. It's Tuesday, October 29th at 7 p.m. We're going to have a worship night here in this room. And the reason that we're having a worship night is to put our heart and our hope in the right place. Over the next couple weeks, you are going to be tempted and outright encouraged to put your hope for the future of this world in a very particular outcome. And what worship does is it helps us put our heads and our hearts in the right place. That God is bigger than any president. He's bigger than any election. He's reigned from the beginning of the time. He will reign throughout all of eternity. And worship helps us put our hope in Him. And so my hope is that we pack this place out. Like I have to stand in the corner because I don't even have a chair to sit in. And it's not because I'm interested in gathering a big crowd. It's because I'm convinced that when hundreds and a couple thousand people put our hearts where it matters, and put our hope in what is true, it can change families and communities and even a country. And I want to extend a special invitation and maybe even a challenge to one particular group that's here today. I want to encourage the men that can hear my voice to prioritize being here on October 29th. Fellas, some of you love to worship. And I love that you love to worship. I love that that's your thing. And then for some of us, singing isn't really our jam, all right? I get that. I understand. And so you think when you hear about a worship night, you're like, I don't really think that that's my deal. And I'm with you. I understand that because my biggest fear in life is that the sound guy will accidentally unmute my mic during the music part, and then we'll have to close the doors to this church because it's so bad, all right? It's not good. I cannot sing. But I also know that that's not really the point of worship. Worship is me coming and saying, there's someone bigger than me. And there's something more important than me. And there's someone I'm going to trust more than myself. And so, fathers, your children need to see you worship. Husbands, your wives need you to worship by their side. Regardless of your relationship status, our community needs to see a group of people that take it seriously, that take God at His word and really believe that He can transform us from the inside out. So will you mark it on your calendar? October 29th, 7 p.m. Let's pack this place out. Today, as we wrap up, you're going to have the opportunity to take a symbol that reminds us of why we can trust that God is good as He's in control. And every week we take this symbol called communion. It's got bread and juice, and it reminds us of Jesus' body and blood. And if you didn't grab communion on the way in, all you got to do is raise your hand, and one of our awesome volunteers, they'll make sure you get what you need. And before you take it, let me just remind you that sometimes we can worry that God's in control, but can we trust Him? God's in control, but is He good? And that same God, when he was in control, saw fit to send his son in our place. God was in control when Jesus went to the cross and paid the price for our sin that we couldn't afford, and now has given us grace that gives us new life. It is very good news that God is in control. And so for those of you that are followers of Jesus, you can take this time to remember, but if you're new to all this, new to church, new to God, I want you to know there is zero pressure for you to participate at all. There's going to be verses on the screen, some of those verses you just took a picture of that will help you reflect on what you've already heard. But our weekly prayer is that this will be the first day of a journey with Jesus that you will never regret. For those of us that are already followers of Jesus, you can take this moment to remember and take communion in your own time.